Dobry вечір. Good evening. Welcome to the Ukrainian Institute of America, and tonight's program is part of our Books at the Institute program. My name is Andrew Horodisky. I'm a member and a board member with the UIA and advisor to its arts and literary program. As has been traditional for the past 3 years or so, we open our events here at the Ukrainian Institute with a brief moment of silence where we acknowledge all those who have perished in this evil war in Ukraine. Not just the military, but also innocent civilians, mothers, fathers, daughters, sons, grandparents, and all of those who gave their lives, volunteers as well. So if you would join me for a few moments. Thank you very much. Well, thank you all for your commitment to come tonight to celebrate the creative discipline of writing and to acknowledge writers whose infinite imagination bears us the gift of the printed word. We are delighted to welcome back Yaroslav Trofimov, whose last visit to us presented his internationally acclaimed book of nonfiction, Our Enemies Will Vanish: The Russian Invasion and Ukraine's War of Independence, named the best book of the year by The Economist and appeared in the top 50 books of the year by The Telegraph. This evening, Mr. Trofimov is joined in conversation with Will Chancellor, novelist and fiction editor with the Brooklyn Rail, to discuss the North American release of the debut novel, No Country for Love, which is officially released today, published by Abacus Books. We are honored to be part of its launch. Tonight's special program will be followed by a question and answer opportunity, a book signing, and light reception, where I urge you to further engage with our guests in person. By purchasing a copy of No Country for Love, you are supporting our continued cultural and educational efforts and the public enjoyment of our unique events along New York's Museum Mile. But more importantly, I hope you find the pleasure in its reading. If journalism is the first rough draft of history, fiction is where a writer gets to rewrite that draft and reorder the world to his or her own liking. Journalism and literature are works that have different uses and benefits, both practiced with a promise to improve our lives. The former informs readers about events that have occurred in the current world. The latter is a collection of either prose or poetry that is characterized by the writer's personal objectives, as well as the perceived aesthetic perfection of their final presentation. They both have inherently distinct natures. When we talk about journalistic writing, we're talking about fact-based reporting in which the facts are laid out in an explanatory fashion. The learned 5 W's and H stand for who, what, why, when, and how. Fiction, on the other hand, relies on the reader's imagination. What could have been, or what should have been? What were the characters feeling? Moreover, journalism is much more exterior. Even if it digs deep, it has its limitations, whereas literature has none. Yet they have the same, if not overlapping goals: to express the facts and truth, to enlighten, to persuade, and to entertain. While journalism and literature are distinct in most respects, in the end, they nevertheless complement and reinforce one another, since literature draws from journalism and journalism draws from literature in an infinitely rich, compelling, and meaningful combination, culminating in a contract between writer and reader, not to just look and see, but to read and know. Born in Kyiv, Ukraine, Yaroslav Trofimov is the author of 3 books of narrative nonfiction and 1 novel. The Siege of Mecca, Faith at War, Our Enemies Will Vanish, and the subject of tonight's talk, No Country for Love. Since 1999, Mr. Trofimov has worked around the world as a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, and since 2018 has served as the newspaper's chief foreign affairs correspondent. In 2022, he was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in International Reporting for his work on Afghanistan, and in 2023 for his work on Ukraine. His honors include the Overseas Press Club Award for coverage of India, as well as the Washington Institute Gold Medal for the best book on the Middle East. Will Chancellor is the author of the novel A Brave Man, 7 Stories Tall, published by Harper Perennial in 2014. He is currently writing an alternate history of the Soviet space program titled The Meaning of Certain Dreams. He also edits fiction at the Brooklyn Rail. Mr. Chancellor's writing has appeared in Book Forum, Lit Hub, the New York Times Magazine, Interview, Electric Literature, The White Review, and the New York Times. He recently wrote on the Brazilian painter Lucas Arruda for David's Werner Books. Please welcome Yaroslav Trofimov and Will Chancellor.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I think we are going to begin with a short introduction and maybe how this came about, followed by a reading from 2 sections. Right.
Yeah, I think the danger of discussing fiction books as opposed to nonfiction is that you really don't want to give away the plot. And so you always have to talk around, the hamburger and the burger. So I'll start by talking about how this book came about. So this book is loosely based on the life of my grandmother, Deborah. It was her real name in real life, just as in the book. And I started thinking about this in 2014. 2014, I was living in Kabul, in Afghanistan. I was running the Wall Street Journal's Afghanistan and Pakistan coverage, and I was stuck there because everybody cared very much about who will win the Afghan elections. And the future of Afghan democracy seemed to be top of everybody's minds. The little war that started in Ukraine was secondary news. And I remember being shocked when Russia invaded Ukraine for the first time, annexed Crimea, moved into Donbass, how little the conflict was understood and how little of Ukraine's history appeared to be known, even the people who were sympathetic to Ukraine. And, there's a very simple explanation to this. Ukraine was not an independent country for a long time. It only regained independence in 1991. And even the people who were benevolent towards Ukraine learned about it through Russian eyes, because, through the Russian studies. And I felt that the complexity of Ukraine's history, Ukraine's society, needed to be told, and needed to be told through a life story, through the form of fiction, because let's face it, history books are boring for most people. And so I started writing this, and it took a while, and I came to a fork in the road at some point because I had to decide whether it's a biography or it's a novel. And I decided to go for the novel because I could, in the form of fiction, I could just tell more and make the story more compelling. But I've also spent 8 years researching it. So I went to every location described in the book, spent days and weeks in the archives, in libraries. And while the story of the main character is fictionalized, everything around it, I tried to make it as true to the historical record as possible. And so, in a way, it is a history book, but much more than that. It's it's a story of love, it's a story of betrayal, it's a murder mystery, and I guess the meaning of the book is also to show how Ukrainians survived this very, very dark period. It's set from 1930 to 1953, which is a time when Ukraine was probably the deadliest place on earth. 4 million Ukrainians were killed in the artificial famine and the Holodomor, 1932-1933. Then came the wholesale execution of the Ukrainian creative classes, of the Ukrainian intellectuals, the writers, painters. Then was the Second World War, the Holocaust, in which my great grandfather, so they perished, and then there was the devastation of Kiev and the rest of Ukraine in the war. And then when the rest of Europe was starting to rebuild and return to peaceful life, there was another decade of bloody insurgency in Ukraine that only really ended with the death of Stalin in 1953. And so that history is really not something that is present in the world's consciousness by design, because it was hidden, it was distorted by the power that controlled Ukraine, so the Soviet Union. And it's only the new generations of Ukrainians today that are discovering it and learning it. And it has become a very powerful force in what is happening today in the war, because the knowledge of what happened last time that Ukraine was under Russian rule, the knowledge of all this tremendous devastation is what's forcing the Ukrainians today to resist the way they are, because they know that, I think if you ask people in Ukraine, kind of why are you keeping up the fight despite those horrendous losses and the destruction? The answer you hear very often is that because we know that if we surrender, it will be worse, because there'll be more death and more destruction. This is what our history has told us. But it's a history that Ukrainians know, but not necessarily known outside the country. And so I finished writing this book in January 2022, just before the full-scale Russian invasion happened. And there are scenes in there of bombs falling in Kiev and destruction in Kiev that I imagined, and suddenly they became true just a month later, which is it turned out I imagined them kind of the way they were in real life. So without giving it a plot, I will read two passages. One is just the very beginning, so it's the prologue to the book. I would need to retrieve my glasses for that. So this is Kiev, March 1953. Stirring a slice of lemon into a cup of weak tea, Darya peered through the window at the snowfall. It was well past midnight, but she couldn't sleep. Her husband, a colonel in the Ministry of State Security, was late once again. Although not so late as for it to be unusual. In the bedroom, Darya had tried to read a tattered old novel with the superfluous letters of pre-revolutionary Russian spelling, portraying a quaint world of leisure. But she kept raising her eyes from the page, tormented by the same poisonous thoughts that had kept her awake for months. Cradling the warm cup in her hands, she pressed her forehead against the window's icy, comforting pain, hoping that her headache would go away. The night was moonless, the lights in other apartments long ago turned down. Darya strained, tried to see through the gauze of snowflake swirling through the wind. That's when she noticed a portly, familiar shape trudging uphill, struggling to keep his balance on the slippery cobblestones of Kiev's St. Andrew descent. The colonel was navigating the obstacles with surprising success, considering the degree of his inebriation. Then, another familiar figure stepped out of the shadows. Darya felt lightheaded. She had imagined this moment in vivid detail, night after night, but never allowed herself to believe that it would actually happen. The colonel seemed surprised, opening his arms in giddy recognition. Then, pressing his hands to his chest, he crumpled to the ground. Soaking his gray uniform, blood spread like an ink blot through a pile of fresh snow. Darya couldn't hear the gunshot or see the muzzle flash because the pistol had been equipped with a silencer. But she made out the weapon in the killer's hand as he extended it to dispatch a final shot into the colonel's skull, calmly following proper procedure. He kneeled for a couple of seconds, frisking the colonel's pockets, then strolled away, down the street and into Podil, the downtown area that had been the city's riverside Jewish quarter before the Germans came in and murdered the Jews. On the way, he couldn't resist raising his eyes to glance at Daria's window on the third floor. He didn't see how she recoiled and stepped behind a heavy red velvet curtain. The tea, boiled when Daria was not yet a widow, was still hot in her cup. She closed the curtains, tried not to look at her husband's sprawled corpse being coated by a layer of fresh snow. She tiptoed into the children's bedroom, kissing her daughter and her son on their foreheads, envious of their untroubled sleep. Then she slid under her sheets still smelling of the colonel's sweat, a sweat revolting to her now, and tried to force her mind into numbness. It didn't last long. The bulky black phone, a treasured perk of the state security job that also gave access to uncommon delicacies, started to ring, an ear-splitting, urgent rattle. The colonel's aide was on the line. "May I speak to your husband?" he said in a formal, bland voice. "It's urgent business." "I'm afraid he isn't home yet. Wasn't he supposed to be with you at the party? The party ended a while ago." "Oh, did something happen?" The pitch of her voice edged a bit, just the way a slightly worried spouse would be expected to speak so late at night. The phone probably wasn't monitored, but you could never know for sure. "Have a good night. I'm sure there's nothing to worry about," the aide said evenly. "Nothing at all."
Before you read the next passage, that was excellent, by the way. I wanted to ask you, you said that this came to you, the idea came to you when you were in Kabul, and this was the germ for the book. I wonder if this particular scene was what you first envisioned in your head in 1953, or if it was where chapter 1 begins in 1930.
No, there was a different scene in the beginning. And I cannot say which one because that would sort of give away the key turning moment of the book. But I did want to start with a flashback and then kind of to build up the narrative to it, to give people something to think about as they went along with the narrative.
I'm also I know that the title of your narrative nonfiction book, Our Enemies Will Vanish, is particularly meaningful, taken from the Ukrainian national anthem, right? Was this title early in your conception of the book?
No Country for Love.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the nonfiction book is, as you said, which came out last year. It's based on a line in the anthem, which then goes, "Our enemies will vanish like dew at sunrise." And people just kept saying this to me. So it was a phrase that people kept repeating in Ukraine during the first year of the war. The enemies have not vanished, but as the anthem goes, Ukraine is not dead yet either. So now, as for this, look, it's a book about survival in very, very difficult circumstances. It's about survival. It's in almost impossible circumstances, and the question is, at what cost? And all of us in Ukraine are descended from people who survived that period, which was tough. And to do so, our great-great-grandparents had to do lots of things that were not nice. To have, to make morally compromising choices, if not to sell themselves, then to save their children. And really, the kind of the meaning of the book is to examine, how these choices, how life in a totalitarian society corrodes the soul, destroys love, destroys one's ability to love, and at what cost this survival happens. I mean, this is the narrative arc of this book.
Right. And before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I think the hardship that I believe you're going to read from next of Holodomor is through the character of Elena's eyes. And I think maybe before I ask any questions and get too far ahead of myself, we should just hear from that.
You can ask a question because I will need about a minute to find
Okay, excellent. So the question of whether or not there's a country, whether it's a country for love, seems to foreground both love and the particularity of Ukraine as opposed to any other place where the story could take place. And I get that sense, immediately reading this, that place is at the, it is what is making everything work. And there's a contrast. Well, this is a question that we'll get into later when we talk about the Ukrainian language versus the Russian language. But was that something that you, when you were plotting the book and deciding where this story would take ourselves or take us, did you consciously say, okay, when I'm examining this, it is through Ukrainian eyes exclusively, for how love blends with the land?
Well, it's a book set in Ukraine. It's a book that attempts to explain Ukrainian history, but I think the theme it explores is universal, right? I mean, it's not just Ukraine that put people in positions to make such difficult choices. Ukraine was not the only place where people had to do things to survive, and where the regime was authoritarian or totalitarian. Unfortunately, it's not a unique feature of human history, and people right now in many parts of the world are also living in pretty harrowing circumstances. But I am from Ukraine. This is the story of the country I was born in, and so I did try to make that as genuine as possible. So this is from chapter 13, and it's set. It's February 1933, and so the main character who is living in Kharkiv, which was then the capital of Ukraine, and is relatively sheltered from the famine because people in the big cities had the food rations and were not dying on the streets as a rule. So she's going to visit her former roommate in the village called Pisky. In the pointed hats bearing red stars, soldiers patrolled the Kharkiv train station, the bayonets on their rifles gleaming in the sun. They looked amused when Deborah walked in with a suitcase in one hand and a pink stuffed dog with droopy ears in the other. The dog was for Taras, Olena's child, and she had spent an entire afternoon choosing an oversized toy in the city's central department store. Her just-issued transfer papers were in her coat's inside pocket. Olena's village was more or less on the way, and Deborah had arranged the railway tickets so that she could spend the night in Pisky. It had been a while since she'd last received a letter from a friend, and she was worried. She sat down on the bench next to a table occupied by the station clerk. A train rolled by quickly without stopping. It was made of rough cattle cars. Inside, she could see people, far too many to fit comfortably. One man, without any inhibition, urinated through the side. Another behind emitted a mad laugh. "Who are these people?" she asked. "Kurkuls, saboteurs, hoarders," the clerk answered without looking up. "Going east. Every day these trains go east and mess up our schedules. Your train will be half an hour late. Apologies, comrade." "That's fine. I can wait." Once on board, Deborah settled by the windows to watch the countryside. It was odd. In the past, peasant women would come to the tracks at every rural station, offering pickles, lard, boiled eggs, and cheese pies for sale. But nobody approached the train this time. Every platform crawled with troops, and hardly anyone got on or off. The few villagers she saw had sunken, spent eyes. And there was a stench, an unfamiliar stench that she couldn't quite recognize. She reached Pisky in the late afternoon. Though she had received no reply to her telegram, she still half expected Olena to be there to greet her. The platform was empty, except for a dozen uninterested soldiers. Their job was to prevent people from leaving, not from arriving. Deborah left her suitcase at the station and, clutching the toy, walked into the snow-covered road outside. She scanned it for horse carts, looking for a villager who could give her a ride to Olena's home. She hoped she still remembered the way, but there were no villagers and no carts. The streets were deserted. Only the former church appeared inhabited, its chimney spewing out thin smoke. It should be warm inside, she figured, as she headed to the building, trying not to slip on ice. As she pushed open the front door, The reek of diarrhea and rot punched her in the face. A short, bald man sat by the entrance, behind a scratched wooden desk. "Good morning. I've just arrived on the train from Kharkiv," Deborah said by way of greeting. "From the inspection commission?" the man asked. He stared at the pink dog, bewildered. "From the university," she replied confidently. "Ah." The man clicked his tongue. City women didn't come often to Pisky. He had been told that important guests from Kharkiv would arrive this week. He didn't quite know whether this was one of them, but decided to be helpful just in case. "What can I do for you, comrade?" "I'm here for the Tkach family." A shrill sound from the depth of the building eclipsed their conversation. Then there was banging and more wailing, this time in a different pitch. "What is that?" Deborah asked, her eyes wide. "That's what he came for, Tkach." "I don't understand." "Tkach? Yes. Come with me." The man got up. Deborah followed him into what used to be the priest's quarters behind the altar. A bored soldier sat on a stool. Behind him, she spotted 4 women chained to a bench. The youngest had her hair covered with a shawl. She seemed bloated, with round cheeks and a cracked lip. Her eyes were closed. Deborah gasped. "This one is Tkach," the man pointed. Olena sensed Deborah's presence and opened her eyes. They were glazed over, the eyes of a different person. Her mouth slowly widened in a grin, the same slightly crooked teeth, but now unfamiliar and frightening. She sized up Deborah, examined the toy dog, then cackled in a long, hoarse bout of laughter. You, she bawled. "You've come to me after all." "You did, with a gift. A real big city gift. From a central department store, right?" She tried to get up and come closer to offer a hug, but the soldier sprang to his feet and hit her in the stomach with his rifle butt. "Get back, you murderous cow," he spat on the ground. Olena stumbled, fell, and curled up in pain, whimpering. The other women broke out in loud, satisfied laughter. And who is this tasty bird?" one of them shouted, staring at Deborah. Another yanked Olena's chain. "Why are you beating her?" was the only thing Deborah could say to the guard. The words came out so softly it was as if she hadn't said them at all. "Who is she?" the soldier asked the bold attendant, glaring at Deborah. "She's not supposed to be here. Get her out, now." "Well, she said she had come from the committee, from Kharkiv," the attendant replied. "I am from Kharkiv," she insisted. Taking advantage of the distraction, Olena bounced up with unexpected energy and spat into the soldier's face. He hit her again, harder, and she fell down once more. "You can keep hitting me. I don't care," she muttered. "I'm no longer a person. I'm unbreakable. I don't feel pain. Nobody can hurt me." The attendant squeezed Deborah's elbow. "We'd better go back, comrade," he whispered. "We don't want any trouble." Deborah followed him obediently back to the entrance. "What is this?" she asked. The toy still in her hands, the only hint of color in the dark church. "What is happening?" "You mean Tkach? You didn't know? She made soup." "Soup?" "From her own son," the man said. Deborah didn't understand. "What soup?" "Soup. First, she hacked her mother to pieces to feed herself and her son. There wasn't much flesh left to eat by then. Only the internal organs remained juicy, the heart, the liver. Then, when the mother ran out, she smothered her child and made soup out of him. Taras, that was his name. Nice little boy." Deborah leaned against the wall. 4 such cases in recent weeks. Nobody lets their kids outside anymore. I certainly don't, the man continued. Unlike ordinary villagers, he could count on official rations because of his job. They were meager, but if supplemented by snails and bony fish from the pond, would be sufficient to get him through the winter. Funny thing, now that they've been arrested and are awaiting their trains to the prison, they will actually be fed. They'll get more bread than the rest of them. Where is justice, he wondered. How long ago did this happen? Over a week or so ago. They're holding them here until the commissioner arrives, from Kharkiv, the man went on. You're not from the commissioner, are you? Not really, Deborah admitted. You'd better not stay. Get the first train out, he said, suddenly alarmed. Yes, better not linger here much longer. Problems for you, problems for me. His eyes narrowed with fear as he thought about being stripped of his rations.
Oof. That's a incredibly harrowing scene in context, and it's preceded by something that I thought was interesting. There's a New York Times reporter named Walter who comes to Kharkiv to investigate these claims of famine, and he's convinced by our protagonist Deborah in this moment of compromise on her part somewhat that it's exaggerated. And yet she's able to internalize that delusion herself that it's exaggerated and visit and encounter this. I wonder if you have had a similar experience in terms of war reporting and getting claims from people who's, even though you might know better, you end up following the fiction, as it were.
Right. I mean, first of all, this New York Times reporter, Walter, is a real person. It's Walter Duranty, who won the Pulitzer Prize that the New York Times has never given back for debunking reports of an alleged famine in Ukraine. As for your question, yes, people in these circumstances do rationalize. More than that, in order to be able to keep going, they start believing, even though they know that those are lies. That was not the case with Walter Duranty. I mean, he did it because he wanted the Pulitzer Prize and interviews with Stalin.
And I mean, the scene of Deborah arriving with the pink toy, the pink dog toy, into the, one of the worst famines in history is particularly striking, and being completely useless, right? And that's a feeling that compounds the grief throughout this. And I wonder if that was an animating feeling for you in recounting a lot of this that is historical fiction, and feeling like there's, this pull on the one hand of feeling like this might actually be very useful in retelling the story, versus the other pull of internalizing that hardship and feeling like, damn, I can't do anything.
Well, I mean, watching war zones in general and tragedies, there's always this contrast, because you have this odd bits of normalcy right next to the most tragic circumstances. And people very often live in very different worlds right next to each other. I mean, in Ukraine at the time, the cities were more or less spared, and the countryside was devastated. And so the reality that the character had in Kharkiv, she couldn't quite understand how bad things were in the countryside. And obviously the system was hiding the truth from everyone. But I don't know, I was just in Syria 2 weeks ago, and you could see the same. You are in central Damascus, where everything was kind of normal, and you can drive 10 minutes and everything is flattened, and has been flattened, for the last 10 years. Right.
You've said before that in reporting on Ukraine, the first draft of history is what you're reporting in the moment.
Yeah.
And then when you go through the process of writing a nonfiction book, it's the second draft of history, because you've had the ability now to have some kind of top sight or hindsight and make sense of things that are nonsensical. Do you feel like historical fiction is a third draft of history in that way?
I guess it's a fourth draft, right? So you have the actual history books. Narrative nonfiction, writing this nonfiction book, I got myself realizing how flawed human memory is. Because I was writing it just 6 months, sometimes after the events. And I would write a chapter, and I would go to my notes. And now that we record all our interviews and, WhatsApps and photographs, I just realized, there are this entire, sequences of events that are completely blocked out from memory. Because we're all very unreliable narrators by nature. Which makes you actually question a lot of the nonfiction books written before iPhones existed. Now, if we then came the actual history books, and then we're trying to make sense of that past, and merge history with universal themes. Because this book has a universal theme through it that is applicable not just to Ukraine, but it's also trying to tell the story of Ukraine through this universal theme.
And I wonder in particular, you've researched this book for 8 years. I assume that there are family stories that have been passed down through your mother, and that this in itself is a fictionalizing of history in order to make sense of hardships lived. Did you find yourself, the fictional writer side of you, editing things away, or were you very careful not to edit certain things? How did you negotiate that process of family memoir?
Well, it's not a family memoir. It's a novel, and so there are liberties with the main character, and some of the things that she does in the book are things she probably wished she had done in real life but didn't. So I did sit down with my grandmother when she was in her 90s, and we had very long conversations about what had happened in her youth, all the things she was afraid to say when I was younger, or was ashamed to say. But she had already passed away by the time I started writing the book, and so I couldn't go back to her. I didn't have any sort of other way of coming back and asking more questions, so I had to work with what I had. And I think once you start doing this, you realize that, and I think I realized this doing like one of my previous nonfiction books, that, reality is very messy. And in reality, things, take circuitous routes. And I remember writing the book about the siege of Mecca in 1979 and thinking, I just wish I could simplify this. I just wish I could have, and you can't, composite characters, and you can't with nonfiction, obviously. But sometimes, as you do with fiction, you can actually get to a bigger truth by taking the shortcuts. Obviously, if you label it as fiction.
Right. Yeah. I think there's one novelistic turn that you make in regards to the Holodomor that I thought was really brilliant. You leave in March of 1932, chapter maybe 10 ends there. And then we pick up immediately in January of 1933, only winter, right? No moment of relief, no letting up. It's winter, and February is furious, right? In Ukrainian. And those kind of pacing decisions, I think, first I just want to praise you that was something that was, that is the craftsmanship that, the novelistic craftsmanship that I really enjoy in the book. I'm wondering if if that balance was deliberate, if that just happened subconsciously about, not having that moment of release and then waiting until part 2 for any moment of spring to arise.
I think it was conscious, but also, the book packs, 25 years in only so many pages. So you have to really zoom in and zoom out of the narrative, and make your choices for that. And, I think focusing just on the pivotal moments and moments of the greatest contrast makes it more interesting and keeps the pace.
Certainly. Yes. There's a line, I think it was the one line that stuck with me the most. It was right around, I thought you might get to it in this excerpt because it's right around there, but it's in Kharkiv when Deborah's speaking to a municipal worker, and she, again, is at this huge divide of her cloistered university life with a canteen full of food, right? And he said,
some food,
right? Yeah, it's some food, and he says to her, "You are the ones who survive. Enjoy," and that
as he's picking up a frozen child,
exactly, right,
on the street,
and facing the hardship of Holodomor and the contrast, but the way that line is delivered of survival and enjoyment being completely eradicated is something that, to me, is the center of the book, is the struggle of how to find these moments of joy amidst such hardship. Do we try to elevate these small moments of peace, or do we surrender to the unrelenting hardship when we're in it?
Right, and she doesn't surrender, right? I mean,
Right.
She's, she enters the book as this naive, hopeful young woman, full of aspirations and believing in the glorious future. And then at some point she realizes there is a phrase there saying, the good people do not survive. So you have to be bad to survive. And she starts doing things that are not so good.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if the ethical compass is completely inverted at times, right? And to where survival is the only thing that you're thinking of. I wonder if you've seen that. Has that word changed for you at all? Survival over the course of your career, and as an imperative that, justifies different ethical action? Or
Well, I don't think we can talk about, does it justify or not. Also, I mean, everyone who has committed terrible things probably, at war, very often invoked this, well, I had to do it, I had no choice. So people have choices, and people make choices. And the question is, in this system where everyone at the end is complicit, because you cannot survive if you're not complicit in one form or another, exactly where do you stop? Exactly where do you decide that, well, no, I cannot do this? And also, like as the book kind of explains, sometimes you just don't realize what you have done, and because it's just so easy to betray, it's just so easy to be part of the system. And also in her case, she was not necessarily doing it for herself, but she had children who were dying.
Right, and the suspension of some of the moral absolutes is, and it's the Sophie's choice problem, right? And I'm wondering, if you finished this in January of 2022, I wonder if you would have finished it in 2024, if some of that, if some of the outrage would have played more of a role in the book, or if there's any.
No. So I submitted it to the publisher in January 2022, but it went through sort of line edits and different tweaks for another 2 years, and not really much was changed in terms of language structure, because I was surprised actually I think I was talking about this earlier, how this imagined Ukrainian war was actually very close to the real Ukrainian war in some ways.
I think in great fiction, there's always a sense of uncovering a fossil that's there, and there's truth, just in the process of getting the fossil and dusting it off, that enables you to see the larger articulated structure, which to a large extent we're seeing now play out in Ukraine. And maybe, if Ukraine has been seen through Russian eyes, and this novel is an example of seeing Ukraine through Ukrainian eyes, in what way does the history at work in this book prepare Ukraine to deal with 2025?
Well, people in Ukraine, are more familiar with Ukrainian history than people outside of Ukraine, because thankfully in the last 30 years, there was an education system that taught people what really happened in their country. There's a scene here in the book where the character is in Kharkiv, and she goes to a party in Slovo, which is a building where all the writers and artists were living in the 1930s, well, 1920s, really. And pretty much everyone who lived in the building was arrested, sent to camps, and then executed in 1937. So the entire generation of Ukrainian intellectuals was gone. And they were so wiped out from history that even after the death of Stalin, like when I was growing up in Kiev, we all knew about Russian dissident writers. We knew about Solzhenitsyn and Pasternak and Mandelstam, and there were all this, books being passed around. But the names of the Ukrainian ones, like Valerian Podmohylny, it was just a blank. No one knew them. They were only discovered after Ukraine became independent. And so I am introducing, they're kind of, sad characters in one of the scenes in this book, introduced by the first names. But I was really heartened because I had a book reading in Scotland, and my moderator was a Ukrainian woman who is a graduate of Ukrainian literature studies. And she's like, well, I know who this is. This is Podmohylny, and this is Mykhola Khviliovy. This is so you do have this return now in Ukraine of knowledge that was so thoroughly suppressed that even curious people like me who went to Ukrainian language school in Ukraine did not know.
Well, that was what I was very curious about, specifically the eradication of Ukrainian, right? So the novel begins with a enthusiasm for the renaissance of Ukrainian as a language. Then very quickly, Stalin, crushes that. And you were in university really in the first generation of the revitalization of
Well, no. So, for those of you who are not familiar with Ukrainian history, the Ukrainian language was basically banned in Russia, in the Russian Empire. You could not print books in Russian. There was no in Ukrainian. There was no education in Ukrainian. Ukrainian culture survived because a chunk of Ukraine was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so Ukrainian historians and writers could go there and print books like Grushevsky and others. And then, as part of the effort to attract the Ukrainian peasantry to the communist cause, when the Soviet Union was established, there was a program of Ukrainization in Ukraine, in which it became mandatory to study Ukrainian, and many Ukrainian intellectuals moved to the Soviet Ukraine, including Grushevsky, the former president of independent Ukraine, who became, a member of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences in Kharkiv. And so there was this cultural revival that only lasted a brief moment in time, and then 1930 it was over. And then, those people were arrested. The kind of ideological father of Ukrainization, Skripnik, who was, I think, Minister of Culture. So he committed suicide in the skyscraper, one of Europe's first skyscrapers that was built in Kharkiv, and that was the end of it. And so when I was growing up, there were no universities that were teaching in Ukrainian in Kiev. I went to Ukrainian language school just because I went to an art school, and it was one of the very few Ukrainian language schools in Kiev. But it was a high school. It was no university.
Oh, okay. So, and did you have a period? Did you watch your peers as their, as your courses are conducted in Ukrainian for the first time? Did you watch a kind of a toddling happen, like people gradually moving from middle fluency to full fluency to creating?
Obviously, if you look at Kiev now, Kiev in 30 years ago was 90% Russian-speaking city. And Kiev now is, I'd say, 2/3 Ukrainian-speaking. It's kind of a process that has happened in many places elsewhere in Eastern Europe. I think there is a discussion about this in the book. There was a saying in the 1930s that Ukraine is sort of a Ukrainian sea on which Russian-speaking cities are floating. And as the expectation was, once all these people move into the cities, they will take them over, which is what happened in places like Prague, which was a German-speaking city, until the Czechs moved in, or Riga or Tallinn, which were German-speaking cities too, before the Estonians and the Latvians took over. So you have this process in Ukraine now, but also as part of a political choice. People in Kharkiv, where almost nobody spoke Ukrainian in the last 2 generations, are switching to Ukrainian now. And I have so many friends, from my childhood, who used to text me in Russian, now text me in Ukrainian.
It's also a virtue of this book that you can read it and realize, in hindsight, just now in your explanation, I realized that through Larissa's father's story, I'm learning the story of the
Skripnik.
Right, exactly. And the way that you're able to balance, you kind of sneak the history in the narrative in a way that I think is really compelling, as opposed to it being didactic and telling us what these things.
Because history books are usually boring.
Right.
Not for me. I like them, but.
And this one, I think is really fantastic as far as the way that history blends into the narrative. I think we're probably at a good point to ask some questions from the audience, and I'm sure people will ask things maybe along similar lines. Yes.
First of all, I want to congratulate you. Amazing. I can't wait to read your book, No Country for Love. I'm really curious, particularly when you talked about language, like how you navigated creating those emotional landscapes of the characters in which language, because did you switch back and forth in your mother tongue? What language did you speak to your grandmother? how did that play a role at all, or
Well, it's easy in the book because it's in English, right?
but like still, like how do you? I mean, you did not speak English to your grandmother.
No. No, I spoke English. I spoke Russian to my grandmother. So I mean, she told me all these stories in Russian, obviously.
And how is that? Is there a part of the limitation of the English language where you cannot access the, you know, the things that I don't know, emotional.
I have always written in English, so I have never written professionally in Ukrainian or Russian, and so I find English to be a very versatile language. And there is a very long tradition of people from our neck of the woods, writing English.
I don't mean to interrupt. Can everyone hear the questions, or would you like to have a microphone by chance? Everyone can hear? Okay. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you, Yaroslav. It's really nice to see you back at the Institute. I was wondering what audience you had in mind when you were writing this book. Is this for an audience outside of Ukraine? If so, would you like to see it translated? Will it be translated? If you could think about that, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think on one level, as just a love story, a story of, a person overcoming or not overcoming adversity, it has universal appeal. On another level, the idea was to explain Ukraine and where it is and how it doesn't fit the stereotypes that people have. And so there is a crossover here. So it is being translated. It's coming out in Europe. And actually, there's a lot of interest in Europe in this because it's
That's really cool.
yeah. So it's coming out it's already out in Dutch. It's coming out in Italian next month, in French this summer, in Portuguese. So there is a lot of interest in Europe. We don't have a Ukrainian publisher yet, but wheels are moving slowly in Ukraine right now in the publishing world.
Give it time.
This is a little bit of a silly question, but
The best.
if you go back in time to let's say the early 1900s when communism was beginning in Russia and Ukraine, is there anything that Ukrainians could have done to have stopped this evil from taking over their country? Maybe that's your next novel.
Well, I think the Ukrainians have learned a lesson now, because I think the lesson of that time is that disunity brings tragedy. And Ukraine fell under Russian rule once again because of this internal squabbles between Ukrainians. And that's why now, you are seeing, 3 years, almost 4 years into the war, you are seeing the society is not fracturing because people realize that, we've learned the lesson of the past.
Thank you for making history interesting in your story. You mentioned that you had access to archives. Was there anything in the archives? Were they in Kiev? I'm assuming they weren't in Moscow, but the richest are in Moscow. Was there anything that you saw or read that was beyond shocking that you already knew, having grown up in Ukraine and talking to your grandmother about her life history?
Yeah, so the archives were the archives of Holodomor, and they are shocking. And, just learn these little details in there, Like, there was this detail in this passage that's just read, okay, we knew there was cannibalism, but we did not know this detail that because everyone was just so, basically, it's just skin and bones, the only edible parts were the internal organs. That was a detail I found in the archives.
It's more of a 30-second anecdote than a story, but you were talking about people didn't know much about Ukraine. Like I learned it like when I was in college, and I heard about Robert Conquest, and then I ran across his book in the store at Barnes and Noble one day, and that's how I learned about it. So I was babysitting my niece about a month ago or so, and she's learning current history, and she has a reading to do about the Holodomor. She's in 6th grade.
Right. Well,
That's something.
things have changed since 2014. Unfortunately, because Ukraine is, at war and people care.
I have Yaroslav. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
I've actually read it as part of Razum Book Club. It
great.
was our book for February. I absolutely loved it. I read it in 3 evenings and 1 night.
Oh,
I
thank
think. After third part, it was just hard to stop. And I also grew up in Kharkiv, so those early chapters about Kharkiv were really wonderful to read, and a little bit strange to read them in English, to read about your hometown. But I have a question.
I like Kharkiv. I really adore Kharkiv.
I have a question about one character, and I want to ask it carefully without spoiling, because I read the book a couple of weeks ago, and certain characters, they kind of stay with you and you think about them. And for me, it was a Pasha, because he kind of really showed through different scenes what it meant to be a child in totalitarian setting, and how children intuitively kind of understand or gravitate to certain behaviors as a kind of survival mechanism. And you don't really give the answer at the end. Like, we know that he went on a certain path, but I don't know how much you can reveal. But is there a kind of hope for him? And what happened to him?
Definitely. I mean, there's hope for everyone. And things eased up after 1953, and it was not as tragic. And
so he's not another Maslov?
No.
I'm curious about that comment that I think about the line that Kafka said to Brod when he was walking, and his literary executor, Max Brod, says, Franz, your work is so depressing, there's just no hope in there anywhere. And Kafka's line is, you completely misread me. There's infinite hope, just none for us. And this does seem to have your spin on it, right? Because I don't get the sense that when representing the hopelessness of a lot of these situations, that it actually is no hope for our characters, specifically for Deborah. And because she keeps proving her heroism by her unrelenting hope and her ability to just keep going through,
and take action, right?
Right.
She's not just taking the blows, and
Right.
she's taking action, and she's changing her fate, and that's how she survives. And so yes, she is corroded, she is making compromises, but at the end of the day, she gets through that meat grinder of history, unlike millions and millions of other people in Ukraine. But yeah, the book is sort of gloomy a little bit, but
I think the emergence of, Pasha in particular is always a notion of hope, right? Through, now that we've mentioned Pasha, all the way through, there is that sense of hope through regeneration and through the next generation and carrying forward and being able to learn something and make slightly, a better path forward. It seemed like that was inevitable.
Yeah. But I don't know. I was just at a literary festival in India, and the panel was me. There was someone who wrote a book about war in Iraq. We had a panel about covering wars in your own countries, and sort of we walked out of there saying, we need to go to a festival about happy books. And he said they will not invite us.
I think there's a question in the back a little earlier. Yes.
Thank you. I actually also read the book, also through Razum Book Club. I think
Great.
there is a bit of representation here of that club. So thank you so much for the book. I think, it was amazing how recognizable a lot of things were just in that passage that you read about, her traveling to the village and kind of not seeing the babushkas on the train stations. And it's kind of something that we still expect, in Ukraine to see. So it was very recognizable. And also, I think this topic that you chose, one of the topics that I picked up on was the price of survival.
Yeah.
So if you think about kind of this family, it's essentially a story of a Jewish family, and I come from Jewish Ukrainian family, and you just think of all these events that kind of could have killed everyone of my relatives, and they survived. So I kind of think, the price is high, and how this topic, did that affect? I'm sure that affected your family, and do you think what's going to be the price of survival for through this, through what's going right now, and are we going to survive better or not? Like, what's your thoughts on this?
Well, really horrible things are happening in the occupied territories of Ukraine, the south and the east, and people are being executed, people are being tortured, and people are betraying other people as well. So you have that, but luckily this is only a small part of Ukraine's population. And Ukraine now has a state and an army, and it's able to protect its citizens more or less in an open fight and a society that is organized. And that's a very different setup from where you just victimized by this machine that just rips through everyone. And so I have a lot more hope for the current generation.
Which is probably a great note to end on.
It is, and I have a question of my own actually. This has to do more with craft. This book is an epic novel with a lot of breadth. It has a innate sense of time and place. But what really kind of was the central thread was dialogue. And my question to you is, for my own kind of personal curiosity, that has come from a nonfiction background, for lack of better words. The dialogue here had a certain kind of pacing. Some of it was a little joyful, some of it was a little melancholy, some of it was direct, some of it was very psychological. And it covered the psyches of various age groups, from the aged to the young person. And I was wondering, where do you get inspiration, or where did you look to for the crafting of your dialogue in this book? Because this is actually what drove the pace of the entire plots.
Thank you for this. I think being a journalist, one of the things you do, you talk to a lot of people and you take a lot of notes of what they say and how they speak. And I think that's probably one of the areas in which doing my day job as a journalist really helped. As was the research of sort of the smaller details that I tried to render in a way as accurate as possible.
I definitely echo that. The dialogue keeps it propulsive, and it's astounding how much you cover and how consistent the momentum and pacing is going through. And I think the dialogue really helps that. Fantastic.
Thank you all.
Well, thank you, Yaroslav and Will, very much. Thousand thanks for coming and for sharing this book with us. We have just a token of our appreciation for you.
Thank you.
Most of all, I'd like to thank the audience for coming. Without you, we could not do these events here. You support our efforts. You support not just the culture of Ukraine, but the culture of New York City. We're a very diverse, very pluralistic society. We have different kinds of thoughts, ideas, perspectives, histories, experiences. So thank you for coming. For those of you that wish to have your book signed, Yaroslav is available for that. And we also have some refreshments for you down the hall. Please enjoy and stay for that. Thank you again.